This is Talking Hardcore, the podcast for people who love hardcore history.
You study history because it allows us to understand the present and prepare for the future.
I'm not trolling.
And I love it.
I'm just pointing out where they're wrong.
The Talking Hardcore podcast is presented by Ace Industrial Solutions. Are you in need of skilled trade professionals for your next project? Look no further. Specializing in commercial and industrial buildouts, floor coatings and coverings, high-speed concrete polish, floor cleaning, shot blasting, painting, energy efficiency, and pallet racking. With a proven track record of excellence, they have become the industry leader. To find out more, please check the link in the description.
All right, you're watching Talking Hardcore or listening to Talking Hardcore. I'm George.
I'm Scott.
And we're here with
Matt,
the author and future trivia question maker.
Yep.
Hopefully.
Yep.
Matt Bella, who is 1-1 in the hardcore history trivia.
No,
if you haven't checked out those episodes, everybody. 2-1, excuse me. That's right. He's mopped the floor with Scott twice. And then lost to me in sudden death.
Yep.
Right. So anyway, we're here today a little bit different than what we normally do. Instead of talking about an old episode or a different thing, we actually have a new episode of Hardcore History to talk about. So we're all a little bit pumped up. We've been listening to this audiobook basically for the last couple of days, and we've all finished it, or Scott's almost done.
Only 6.5 hours.
It's only 6.5 hours. It is legit an audiobook, and I love it. I think his audiobook isn't that long. Isn't as long as the 6.5 hour episode is. Anyway, but so today we're going to talk about that. It's Twilight of the
Asher?
Is that how you say it?
Azier.
Aziers. Twilight of the Aziers Part 2. So if you haven't listened, you're probably going to want to come back to this after you listen to that. Otherwise, there's going to be a shit ton of spoilers. I'm going to tell you now, we're going to spoil some stuff. But since most of this stuff happened over 1,000 years ago, I feel like it's okay for us to spoil it.
You should already know some of the spoilers.
Yeah, but maybe they do, maybe they don't. I didn't know a lot of this, especially the Russian stuff. So anyway, we're going to jump into it. We're also going to set up a live event to talk about this episode on the Discord channel, so look out for that. We'll have a link in the description. We don't know what day yet, but we're going to have something like that. Once you guys are listening to this, there'll be a day picked for that as well, and you can jump into the Hardcore History Discord that Matt runs and come to the live event, and we're all just going to discuss the new episode. So, save your thoughts for then. Okay. So, Matt, what are your thoughts about the newest episode?
I think it's great. It's an epic history. Big kind of zoomed out impression is that it's fantastic that we have such detailed knowledge about some of these battles. I think he connects it really well to Thor's Angels, which he did years and years ago. So picking up that story, and of course he did a supplementary Blitz edition on Thor's Angels. So obviously an important topic to him and something that's been in his mind, and he continued the narrative really well, not only from Thor's Angels and the Blitz from that, but also from Azier Part 1. And really brought us home. He stretched it out the extra distance, 6.5 hours, even apologizing on social media for giving us extra content, which is hilarious and adorable.
Makes no sense to me.
Right. Yeah, and I'm happy that we got all this content out of him, and also that this chapter has been concluded, and I'm looking forward to what he brings next.
I bet he's walking around like a zombie right now.
Totally.
Maybe.
Or different. Maybe he's sitting on the beach somewhere, just
drinking.
Just enjoying the life. But
where's my turkey?
Yeah, 6 hours and 23 minutes. I mean, it's an audiobook, and I loved it. It was great.
May I take a moment to introduce my cat Dazzler, who is now a featured guest of this podcast?
Yeah, she's been on a couple times.
Hey,
is it a dude or a chick?
It's a chick, yeah.
Chick. I guess I should have guessed from the name.
Dazzler. Say hello to the world, Dazzlers. Everyone say hi to Dazzler. All right. Cool.
Cheers.
You got a black cat walking through the screen.
What do you guys think? Big picture.
Yeah.
So interestingly enough, I thought it was awesome. It touched on some points that I didn't really know about. Well, things I knew about and some things I didn't know about, like especially like Greek fire.
That's one thing I made a note about, was to bring up Greek fire. Holy shit, I never heard of that.
You never heard of Greek fire?
It's
in a movie. So
anyway, keep going.
No, I'm going to drop another movie. Real quick.
Go ahead.
It's in a movie called Timeline.
Okay.
Where basically they fax themselves into the past.
Okay.
A bunch of archaeologists end up faxing themselves into the past. It's actually pretty cool.
Okay.
Anyway,
fun.
so,
Fun fact: Michael Crichton also wrote Timeline. I've read that book, Scott. It's a good book, and they made a movie out of it. Yeah.
I bet that book is good. Then he's a good.
Yeah. Michael Crichton also wrote Timeline, and he wrote The 13th Warrior, which is mentioned in this episode.
Well, that's the other one I wanted to bring up. But so
right,
I didn't know. I forgot his name. The Arab that ran into some of the Vikings, or pseudo Vikings, if you want to follow that timeline. Same thing. I think they called him.
You mean from 13th Warrior?
In the 13th Warrior, they called him Aben. I forgot his real name, but anyway, very interesting. The very beginning of that movie.
Scott's talking about a movie called 13th Warrior that kind of tracks some of the events that happen. Well, it's set in some of the timelines from this episode.
Well, yeah, but
Ahmad ibn Fadlan.
Yep. So he was actually, I didn't know it was a real story. As soon as Dan started mentioning it, I was like, man, that's 13th Warrior. Because he gets sent out to be an emissary or an ambassador, and then ends up meeting some Vikings at the very beginning scene.
Man, imagine that.
But it even shows like these guys like taking this bowl and spitting in it and like washing their hair and their face and like, blowing their nose in it and then handing it to the next guy, and he was just absolutely disgusted by that whole thing. But they washed. So
okay, we got to circle back to that because I have thouts on that.
All right.
Keep going.
We are getting ahead of ourselves here. That's a great topic, and I definitely have notes on that. But I would also like to backtrack to more the beginning of the episode.
Right. Yeah, I'm sorry. So the other,
no, you're fine.
I thought it was a great episode. Just a couple things that really stood out that I could relate to from historical things that I've already known about, but I didn't know actual factual basis, and that's
right.
That's kind of what
you didn't know
up.
they were real.
Yeah, I thought it was all bullshit.
Or maybe real, right? Or based on legend, at least.
Yeah.
So, Matt, you started right with Thor's Angels. That is one of my all-time favorite episodes. It fills in so many blanks of what happened after the Roman Empire collapsed before you get to all the way up to Charlemagne. I mean, it's badass.
Yes.
And then Twilight of the Azirs 1, that thing was right in my wheelhouse. So
right on.
My favorite hardcore histories are like what you just called this, which is a historical narrative, right, where he's going broad strokes for the most part. Those are my favorite. He fills in so many places that I find holes in my historical knowledge that they really hit me, because I like the ones where there's a lot of battles and he goes into the details, like in Supernova in the East and all of those. Those are great.
Sure.
But these ones to me are better.
The majority of history, there are battles that changed history, but the majority of history is procedural stuff and politics and trends and forces. And I think it says a lot about you that you prefer to dive in deep like that. That's cool.
I thank you. I appreciate that, but it's probably a little bit less deep than you think. Really, I think of it more of a bang for my buck. I'm learning about 800 years worth of history in 5 hours instead of a year's worth of history. You know what I mean? It's kind of like, give me so Dan does a good job in this episode and in every episode of hitting the high points. Yep. And he's really good at picking out what are the interesting points. A lot of people are going to pick out stuff that is boring, and he just doesn't do that. He picks out the right stuff to focus on to tell that narrative.
Absolutely.
Right? I think this episode's a great highlight of that.
Well, he does the broad brushstrokes, but he also gets into little details too.
The ones that are worth
getting into. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, all the way from like this battle changed this, and then this is how lands were reshaped and borders and influences and cultures developed, all the way down to personal interactions with these earls and chieftains and you know what I mean, and the warriors who rose to lead small and larger armies, like personal interact. You feel like you're right there with them. which is amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, that goes all the way back to Wrath of Khans, right?
Absolutely.
That's the one. I think that's the first of the old ones I've bought that series. So out of all the old episodes, that was the first one I listened to, the old series, and I was like,
yeah,
"Holy shit, you can tell history like this?"
Yeah,
You know
right
what
on.
I mean? And it's
right
like,
on.
this is awesome. It's an oral history. Matt, you pointed this out before. Like, humans have a long oral history tradition, and that's what Dan is doing here.
Yeah.
It's just beautiful that he can record it. So it's an oral history that's preserved forever.
So
And
valuable.
so he talked about on Twitter the other day, Dan talked about how he doesn't script them. So it's very difficult to break it up into parts or to do. It makes it harder to do because everything he does is unscripted, right? So they have to listen back to it, listen to it back an ungodly amount of times, and
Which is
keep changing
amazing
it and it
that
is,
it's
but that's what
unscripted.
that's what makes it feel so much like a conversation.
Yep.
It feels
That's a
like you're
good point.
talking to Dan and you just can't get a word in. That's what it feels like, right?
Yeah.
But in a non-frustrating way, right?
Exactly. Yeah. It's like he's anticipating your questions and before you ask them,
A
and
lot
so
of times, yeah.
all you have to do is listen.
Mm-hmm.
So right at the beginning of the episode,
Yeah.
I have some sort of chronological notes here. So right at the beginning of the episode, he said something that resounded with me, and I believe is important, and which was a theme that was continued literally all the way to the end, and very emphasized at the end. And so what I have is just how serious other cultures take their religious beliefs. Okay, so Dan's talking about how the Vikings believed in elves and fairies and trolls. They had people called troll wise who were wise in the way of trolls, and they had wizards. And I think that's something really important to understand and appreciate is just how seriously other cultures take their religious beliefs, which may not sound that difficult when you're saying it, but how even in the modern world, if you're an adherent to a religion or if you're not, it may be difficult to understand how seriously other people take their beliefs, just as serious as yours, or if you have none, then it is the world to them. Quite literally, it is how the world works. There are influences, there are other beings, there are higher powers.
Right.
And this is something that I will relate to modern events. Now, this may be a crazy association to make right off the bat, but bear with me. But when I hear that, I hear a very similar resonation with commentary on the events in the Middle East that are going on right now. That I hear from a lot of political commentators. Okay, and what they are saying is you have to understand what these people mean by jihad. They believe in paradise. They believe that if they kill an infidel in battle, they will go to paradise. This is not some weird cartoonish mythology to them. It is the world to them. And without understanding that, you will not understand these people or how to deal with them. And Dan says something like that. He's like, these people, this was their mythology. This is what they believed. And at the very end, he said that what makes a Viking? I have to say it's their gods.
Right.
Sure.
And so just follow. Yeah,
because
go for it.
Their gods. We should delve into this because.
Well, let me touch base on one thing, just to expand on what you were saying, Matt.
Yeah.
I remember doing some research on Iceland after watching a movie, and I think it's 50% of the population still believe in elves.
Right on.
Mountain elves. Anyway, I just to expand on that. That was just something that just stuck out in my mind.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
that'll follow up later because he kind of ends the episode with that.
Right. But so let's talk about what you just said, though. What makes a Viking is their gods. And that's because their gods shaped their culture so much. And to a certain extent, all religions shape their cultures like that, right, in history. But man, were the Vikings gods pretty interesting, right?
Yeah.
When your culture is you don't go to Valhalla unless you die in battle and you have to, like, it totally is going to make sure that there's a high percentage of people that are going to be warriors.
Well, that's the
Straight
other
up.
thing. Like, and he mentions this, Dan mentions this in the beginning of the episode. Why they never strayed too far from their weapons,
Mm-hmm.
because
Yeah.
dying without a weapon in your hand meant you couldn't go to Valhalla.
That's something that stuck out to me as well.
Right. And so I think if you're looking at history, in some ways, some people would tell you that culture evolved because they were in such a harsh climate. They were in such a hard place to live.
Exactly what I was thinking.
Geography-wise,
yes,
that made them evolve to be this harsh.
Well, it's and I was about this. That's absolutely in line with my thinking. So, I mean, what is? I don't want to piss anybody off here, but what is religion really? But a way to influence people's behavior towards a certain goal. And if you're living in the desert in tents and everyone's in a tribe, and excuse me, hygiene is a problem, you may have certain restrictions on your diet or cultural practices, like don't sleep with your neighbor's wife, and these have to be passed down from a higher power, because if just some dude in your tribe is saying them, it's not going to have the same authority over generations as God, the creator of the universe, which plays into the very prehistoric notions of higher powers coming from nature or spirits or our ancestors, that we have to understand these people hundreds and thousands of years ago are very much connected to. Okay. Right. So if we look at religion as being a conscious shaping of a culture towards a certain goal, then Viking culture shaping people towards a warrior culture must have a root in practicality. And you said it, George. Yeah. They lived in a very extreme environment where farming was difficult and they had to go raiding. So how do you provide the impetus for people to engage in that behavior and risk their lives, or trepidatious seas, leaving their families? It's your religion.
Right. But the one thing I would push back a bit against, though, is when you say conscious. That implies that the person who made the religion, there was somebody there.
I believe there were people like that in history.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
But I don't know that we can say that for sure.
I don't think we can say it for sure. No, not all the time.
I think a lot of times, and even if it was started with, well, here's an idea, let's tell people this, that doesn't change the fact that then that evolved with the culture and changed without a conscious guide, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah,
so
absolutely.
The culture shapes the religion, and then the religion shapes the culture.
Yeah, absolutely true.
The culture helps create the religion, or the religion helps create the culture. It's kind of a symbiotic relationship.
Yeah, but yes and no. Yes and no. Because if you look at societally, religions have like almost the same base rules. And if you have
some religions.
So, well, wait a minute. So if you have let's say
not ancient religions.
If you have a small community of like 25, 50, 100 people, and everybody starts sleeping with each other's wives, and there's bad feelings, or somebody stealing something from somebody else, and then that creates more animosity.
Yeah, but you're talking about modern religions.
No. I'm just talking about, this is how I think, like the 10 Commandments, right?
It's straight up Judaism. Yeah, I was talking about Judaism as well, and I think that's where Scott's going with this.
But look at the Vikings religion; they don't have the 10 Commandments.
No. But they would still have, like,
I don't think they did. I don't think they did. You listen to Dan talk about these gods, and you look at the Roman gods, right, or the Greek gods. There was no "don't fuck your neighbor's wife," "don't do any of that." The gods were fucking everybody.
Yeah, Odin would come down and sleep with your wife or husband.
So what you're talking about...
That's different. That's a god.
But what you're talking about is literally the next evolution of religion. The monotheistic religions, where they were much more of a code of behavior. What they started off before that was more like what Matt's talking about, where they were literally not guidelines to behavior as much as ideas and stories that helped create the kind of people that could live in that society.
Yes. My point is, what I was trying to make, the point I'm trying to make is, if you have, let's just say you have 25 people. Somebody screws somebody's wife, somebody steals something from somebody else. It creates animosity, it creates bad feelings, and then people kill each other. But hold on. And then
let's hear Scott.
The elders that survive would say, hey, if they survived, or people that survived would say, okay, we have to have a baseline of rules so that we don't have this same thing happen again, where we're basically cutting down our numbers in half. That's where I think some of this stuff comes from. Maybe not with the Vikings. I don't know about Viking husbandry and how that worked with, people screwing each other's wives or whatever, but I have a feeling that you really didn't steal from your neighbor either.
No, they said most of the time they went raiding.
Yeah,
They
but you
went
didn't
raiding,
steal
and they
from
were
your buddy.
very polite when they were in their home cities, right?
Yeah.
But we don't know that that's because of the religion.
No,
right?
no, I'm not saying it's because of religion. I think it's a framework for every society where
Right. Well,
you have to maintain. Yeah, it's a framework for society where you have to maintain at least an equilibrium where everybody's not trying to kill each other.
Order.
So in the
that's what
example
society is.
in the example of
That's what civilization is. Sorry.
Exactly, and religion does hold together civilization. And you mentioned this, Christianity equals instant bureaucracy, George. So I think that's a good point to maybe follow up on. But I think the connective tissue that Scott is touching on is that if you're trying to drive a group of people who, on their own, would succumb to their more baser natures and destroy themselves, then religion can drive you towards survival. And if that means not sleeping with your neighbor's wife because the guy in the tent next to you is going to fight with you, or don't mix your meat with your milk because it's going to spoil, that's one form of survival. But if that also means going out and raiding for resources because you live in an extreme climate, that also means your survival.
Right. But what I'm talking about though is hunter-gatherer tribes throughout history. I mean, what we know by studying them now and stuff is people tend to get along with their own tribe, and it doesn't need a rigid hierarchy. There usually isn't a hierarchy
as long as you have somebody not being an asshole.
What people, but that's because there's other ways that they deal with that, which is ostracism.
Sure.
If you get ostracized and you live in the wild in a hunter-gatherer tribe, you probably starve.
Yeah, it's very,
probably,
very important.
Not always, but probably. So that's the cultural carrot and stick there is ostracization. So most of the time, there's a big incentive for you to not be an asshole without there being any formal rules. And that's really what it is. The formal rules are when society got too big where you couldn't ostracize people. You couldn't control their behavior with social norms, with pressure from their peers because they couldn't possibly know everybody. So then you get to the point where you have to make laws to handle sociopaths and psychopaths, and that's really what civilization is for, is to protect against the sociopaths and the psychopaths.
I'm just saying, I think that it also applies to smaller groups too.
Right, but it works in a different function.
That's the only point I was trying to make. I was just trying to relate that point, especially to religion.
I'm gonna relate this to two podcasts and sort of a concept here. So like, Andy Stumpf, the former Navy SEAL who does a podcast called Cleared Hot, recently interviewed Sebastian Junger, who made a documentary about a forward operating base in Afghanistan called Restrepo, documentary of the same name, and he did it on Veterans Day in tribute.
Oh, that's right. You told us about that. I gotta check that out.
Right on. And so he interviewed Sebastian Junger because Junger has a background as an anthropologist, and what they're talking about there is sort of a part of the conversation was the follow-up after war, and how the military will give you this incredible bonding experience, but then when you get out, it's more difficult to process. And Junger directly relates it to excuse me, to tribal behavior where everyone went through the same trauma together and then they processed that trauma together. Okay.
Right.
And that is a big experience, is that you are doing everything together. And so that kind of weeds out, or it prevents psychopaths from occurring because you don't feel ostracized. Now, the Martyr Made podcast is done by Daryl Cooper, Navy veteran, and Jocko Willing, former Navy SEAL. I'm sorry. On the Martyr Made podcast recently, he actually had a conversation with Daniele Bolelli, who does History on Fire. Right, he's a friend of Dan Carlin's. Okay, so they did a podcast episode on the Martyr Made, and it's a bonus subscriber feed, I believe. And so they just basically recorded one of their phone calls because these guys talk about cool stuff all the time, and they're like, "Why don't we record this?" And the episode is actually called "What We Should Record This." Okay, so they're talking about tribal behavior way back in the day, and it's sitting around the fire telling stories. And in the background is just complete darkness, and out there is lions roaring and reptiles sneaking around and death. Okay,
Right.
so like that is the bonding experience. That is the prohibition against being ostracized from your tribe, because if
Being
you're
an asshole.
ostracized from your tribe, exactly, you're going to be on your own, and nobody survives alone in that kind of an environment.
Well, most people don't.
Right. Yeah.
But then maybe one guy does, and he goes kidnaps a woman and makes a whole city. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
maybe that was the guy who founded Rome. You know what I mean? Who knows?
Without minus the kidnapping, that probably would have been me. I would have been like, "You guys are mean to me. I'm going to start my own city with everything
and
cool."
then died, got eaten. Yeah. Well, at least you could rest assured that at least they're not getting a lot of meals out of you, whatever's eating you, right?
So just following up
It's
from
not
the religion
providing a lot
thing.
of calories.
Yeah, I'm a slender guy. So just following up from the religions thing, the next thing that stuck out to me was that Dan said that Scandinavian religions were proprietary to those people and not able to be shared by other cultures, literally biologically connected
Right.
to the Scandinavian people. So,
Which is interesting. And I
it is
don't know
interest-
of
it is
other
interesting.
cultures. Like the Romans, I don't think so. They had a pantheon of gods. The Greeks
Sure.
did, but I don't think they believed like that, right? I don't think they were like, no, you can't worship Jupiter. It's like, no, go ahead.
Yeah, sure.
You
Tithe.
know, it wasn't like Christians where they were literally trying to spread the religion.
And in the context of Dan's theme of Christian integration into Scandinavian culture and religion, that is a very interesting point, because okay, you're not going to be accepted into a Viking clan and become one of us, and maybe we will very much disdain the opposite happening where, oh, you're a follower of Odin, prove it. But Christianity was accepted into their pantheon, and I one thing that really fascinated me about Thor's angels was the depiction of Jesus in Viking culture. Like they found out like a carving of Jesus with an axe in his hand, right?
Yeah.
So
Or
it's
spear.
very much assimilated. Or spear, yeah, right.
Very awesome.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
He's more like
that,
a warrior.
You're right, Matt. That was my favorite part of Thor's angels too. Like how much Christianity changed when they were impacted by the French and the Germans and then the Vikings. Like it completely changed that religion. And it's very interesting to me. Also changed the people.
Yeah.
It pacified them a bit, I think you could argue.
Is there something malleable about Christianity that allows it to be so assimilated? Because not, other maybe religions are more hardcore and extreme. I would say that Christianity may have been more extremely peaceful in that context, but yet it was radicalized to suit the ideologies of the Vikings and other cultures. So is there something unique about Christianity that has allowed it to adapt and so become so widespread?
I don't know. I mean, seems like if anything, you would look at Judaism and see how it's kind of adapted to become Christianity and Islam a little bit too, right?
So when I look at ancient religions, I see the individual polytheism as being individual representations of emotions, biological functions, or intentions. Okay, you have the goddess of fertility, you have the goddess of the harvest, the goddess of the sunrise, right? And then monotheism, right? Yeah, exactly. And then monotheism sort of incorporated all of these under one umbrella, and the narrative of Christianity will be, oh, that's part of us, because Yahweh is everything, and so everything is contained within that. And so it kind of can find a narrative to suit any purpose. And I'm not sure how the Christian Orthodox religion reacted to the depiction of Jesus by the Vikings at that time, but I bet they weren't disappointed to have so many more followers, no matter what they were doing with it.
It was a deal with the devil. Not with the devil,
right?
But I mean,
it
was a compromise.
That is a good way of putting it. That is a good way of putting it. Yeah.
I mean, it was definitely a compromise. Like, okay, wait a minute. Yes, okay, you get baptized. Dan talks about this. It was great. The monks there.
Yeah.
When the monks are there and they're telling these stories from the Bible, but changing them into Viking type character sagas.
Totally, man.
Fascinating, right?
Yeah.
Well,
you have to do that.
You have
make
to
a
relate to your
audience. Of course. Right? That's how you're going to sell them on it, right?
Right.
And then you'd have mass baptisms.
Right. And then most of those people would still go back to believe it. They never changed their beliefs.
He talks about that, like when
Mm-hmm.
after Rollo, and we're jumping ahead. I got some more stuff before this, but
Sure.
when like after Rollo, when like some of the Vikings were forced to like go through the Christian rituals, they did not take them seriously, right?
Right.
Like yeah. And then
Right.
they definitely did revert to, and I think even Rollo, or was it another guy who kind of hedged his bets, and he's like, okay, I'm going to donate a bunch of money to the Christian church, but I'm going to sacrifice 100 Christians to my pagan gods just in case.
Was it the Russian dude?
Yeah.
I think it wasn't Rollo.
I wish
think it was the Russian dude.
Yeah, that was a good one.
No, but yeah, I mean, yeah, he donated a bunch to the church, and then he also had 1,000 Christians beheaded.
Right. Yeah,
just in case Odin was real.
Well, and Dan even brought up.
Think of how fucked up that is.
Dan brought up in the episode, like kind of like how the cons would do it. Well, they might have not have participated, but they wanted you to pray for the con.
Right, but this is a little different. This is okay.
Personally wanting to.
You might be right, and Jesus might be real, and if he is, I'm gonna say my prayers to Jesus. But just in case he's not real, I'm gonna behead 1,000 of his followers. Like that's not gonna piss him off. Think about how that makes no sense.
I see that
hilarious.
I see that as being the reality of the afterlife, as being incredibly important to these people. Okay, and that is somewhat in contrast to the cons or the Romans, who merely wanted stability in their empire and were willing to allow any religion to function as long as it did not disrupt that stability.
And I think
Persians as well.
Well, and I think that was
straight up,
and it was because those were not empires yet, and partly we talked about this, but partly the way they became empires and kingdoms is by harnessing Christianity as a structure, because they didn't have like a Roman system of city-states, and there was all this structure already, bureaucracies. Look at Asia's had. It was easy to conquer Asia because once you took over, right, they already had all this internal structure of competence for taxes and all that revenue and all that stuff, right? Well, they didn't have this stuff in Scandinavia. They didn't have that stuff in Germany, right? So Christianity would be the way that you could just, Dan says this, and that was the best quote. He's like, instant bureaucracy, just add Jesus. You already mentioned that, Matt. That's what it was. Because, okay, so we add Jesus, we get churches here, they collect the tithes, they send that up to the Pope, or they send it up to the bishops give it to the king, right? And the king takes his cut and sends the rest to the Pope. But it's instantly all the structures that we have developed, but just done through one religious organization.
Yeah,
that's a good point. That's probably a very large part of the success of Christianity in that time when borders and kingdoms were being reshaped, and also due to the time period, like you said, George, after the fall of the Roman Empire that was kind of holding everything together, the Catholic Church really held things together as far as being literate and writing letters. And just the structure of government generally. The Black Plague took a huge toll on that, and the quality of the church began to degrade after that. But the structure of civilization as held by the church for so long is an important point.
Yeah. I mean that gave society structure, and without the structure, there is no society, right? So it's very interesting. But okay, let's get to the fun part of this episode.
Okay.
The crazy Vikings and the Rus, all that stuff, right? When they're Saint Olga.
Olga?
Yeah, what was it? No, what was the one you said your mother-in-law was telling you about?
Yeah, Saint Olga.
Saint Olga, right? Like those stories Dan tells are amazing.
Which, little background, so my mother-in-law and wife were asking me if
Russians.
They asked me, they're Russian. So they asked me if I knew who Saint Olga was, and I don't even remember. It might have been before or after we watched the 13th Warrior. My mother-in-law started talking about Saint Olga and how her husband was slain, and then she just basically went on a rampage and just killed a bunch of people that were killed off the opposition, basically. And they were like, oh yeah, she got guys drunk and then had her men slaughter them, or
Set the building on fire.
Set the building on fire with them in them, buried them alive. Like they told me all kinds of. They told me those stories, and as I'm listening to the episode, I'm like, oh,
so cool,
yeah, I
so
remember
cool,
that.
Yeah,
so cool, man.
So that what tells you is that that's still taught
absolutely
in Russia.
Yes,
literally 1,200 years later.
It's amazing.
Well,
that's amazing.
And it survived communism because nobody was allowed to believe in religion.
Right, but that was before she was, and that's probably why it survived, because they're like, look at what badass shit we did before we became Christians.
Exactly.
Nobody fucked with us then.
Well, see, the
right?
Rus, but Dan even says that the Rus weren't Russians. The Rus were Swedes.
Right.
But then
well, it was a combination of the Swedish overlords taking over the Slavic people and then ruling them. So you kind of think of it kind of like Alexander the Great or Ptolemy, maybe, ruling Egypt.
Yeah.
But long enough that they really did become Russian.
Yep.
Because that was 1,200 years ago.
Well, then you have a lot of Viking blood in Russia today.
Yeah, we're talking about did, right?
We're talking about Scandinavians becoming Western Europeans. We're talking about Swedish becoming Russians. We're talking about the Anglo-Saxons and cultures mixing and changing and legacies, and the Germanic kings in England and it really is a fascinating period of history.
So this episode, it really does split it up into two parts, right? There's the parts where the Scandinavians are running amok in England.
Yep.
And then there's the parts where they're running amok in the East and kind of creating Russia.
Yep.
Which is a fascinating way to think about it, right? So like two large-ass world powers were 100% shaped in large part by the interactions with the Vikings in the early or the late 900s to the early thousands. Really
1200s?
in large, no, I mean before that even. I mean, this is really from like the 700s or 800s to like 1100.
Gotcha.
Those two giant cultures in world history, known for different traits, right? The British, look at how much they accomplished when they were just this little island, right? How much of that is because they had that Scandinavian just badassery? And then the Russians, hard to conquer. Right?
On their own territory,
Right, on their own territory, hard to conquer. And you wonder, they share some blood there.
Yep.
It's interesting.
Historical arsonists, that is a common theme in Dan's work. And the Vikings, that's a note I have here. The Vikings were proven very much to be historical arsonists, and that means that this outside force comes in, sets fire, causes destruction, disrupts things, and when things settle down, through the effects of that disruption,
everything's different.
Everything's different, and it really forms the world we live in today. But sometimes for the better, sometimes when you're living through it, it's probably for the worse.
Well, I mean,
but
what are the Russians?
Sometimes it does provide. Sometimes it does provide order. Just very specifically, as far as Dan's comments in this episode. That the disparate kingdoms of England, were sort of fragmented when the Vikings came in and started conquering. It allowed things to be unified, and that is a theme in Wrath of the Khans, where the Mongols were invading. And this is in places like Poland, and these little kingdoms, they're petty squabbles, and they're like, "Oh, you're being invaded? Oh, I'm so sorry to hear about your troubles. Oh, I hope it works out well for you. I have no troops to send. I'm tied up with my own things. We'll see how it goes and clean up the mess." And then the trouble comes for you, and they were unable to unify. And you know what I mean? So
they were all still tribes.
That's
they
absolutely
were just larger version of tribes.
Yeah, that's what feudalism is.
Well, and that's the same. So you'd want to talk about like Russia and England, right? Russia was constantly invaded. So whoever was left had to be good at the defense and stubborn and not, and a badass warrior too. But the same thing with England. England had been conquered so many times by so many different peoples. Whoever was left standing had to be the cream of the crop.
Right.
So that just to expand on what you said earlier about England and Russia.
Right. That's the other thing. It sharpens it sharpens humanity. The people who came out on top in those regions had some damn good genes because they survived some crazy times.
Yep.
Right?
But then you get
Whereas
the
the
same
people
thing
who were on top in France hadn't survived crazy times for a while.
Yeah.
That's a good
by
point.
that
Yeah.
point, right?
Right.
So
And it happens.
You diluted the sharpness.
That's a very, very important point of this.
Same thing happened in Rome, right?
That and in the Mongol Empire, where they had to send people back to the steppe to learn how to be hard again. And Dan, very much in Twilight of the Aesir Part 2, he says this. He says, the Vikings, their main advantage was sweeping in from the sea, right? Shock rage, shock and awe. We're gonna take your stuff. You've never seen anything like this. We're gonna take all your stuff and we're gonna leave, and you can't get us because we live far away across the ocean. Nobody knows where. Once they started being like, okay,
we're gonna stay.
Either they are granted these lands as a boon for their for their treaty that we won't attack you anymore, or whether they just stayed there. They did settle down in close proximity to the people who they were formerly and in some cases currently raiding, which removed that advantage entirely. Okay, so maybe not being soft, there is an aspect of that, but that advantage is removed. Where now, you want to go raid your neighbors, they can come right back at you, and it changes
the reason they were still successful.
Yeah,
is because they were still closer to that savagery.
Yeah,
and less cooked.
Well, and one thing
that's cooked. Absolutely, yeah.
I love like that term.
Yeah, me too.
Dan,
yeah.
Okay, if you don't know what I'm talking about, in the Wrath of the Khans, Dan talks about this Chinese term. He talks about it in this episode too.
Yep.
The Chinese would talk about the tribe steppe people that live closest to them. The goal was them when they were introduced to new steppe peoples, it was to cook them as fast as possible, and that means get them civilized, get them less savage, because they were way less dangerous. And you see that
were they cooked or uncooked?
What is European history except that, right? European history is just the cooking of all of these different tribes. Until now, they're all pretty damn cooked.
The Pax Romana was the cooking of all its provinces. That was enforced civilization. Yeah.
Yep.
But where the Chinese were unable to conquer the Mongols, so they had to do it, plying them with this
or they
still
would cook them as they were being led by them, even right.
Those
dynasties.
Absolutely. Yep. And
they're still continuing.
And that's exactly what happened in Western Europe. It's like they cooked them by placating them with titles and lands and money.
Right. Yeah.
Well, the one thing, since we brought up the traversing the ocean and going raiding and everything, I couldn't believe the boats.
Oh man, he said a very specific note I had. Please do go into this, but God, his description of seafaring, epic.
So, not even like the traditional longboat where you have 50 guys in it or whatever. I'm talking. Excuse me.
Geez. Yeah.
It's okay.
That's so great.
I'm talking about like the transport ships where he said they held like 30 tons.
Yeah.
And in my mind, when I'm thinking, I believe he said 30 tons, but
it was something like that.
So when I'm thinking about 30 tons in a boat going from Iceland,
made of wood,
and made of wood in terrible waters, in the terrible Arctic, Atlantic waters.
They were literally those. Yeah, go ahead.
I just couldn't imagine. I couldn't even imagine, one, that they would be able to build a boat that size. Two, that it'd be able to hold that much weight. And three, that they're taking this thing across the Atlantic into Europe.
Insane. The trepidation, the rogue waves, as Zen describes them. I mean, he spends a lot of time on just rogue waves. I mean, that was gripping. That was so fantastic.
It was, and I had never even heard that term before.
Wow.
Had you heard that term before?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a
Had you
rogue
heard
wave.
rogue waves before? I had never heard that term before.
I have, but it was from, once again, movie reference.
Right.
The Perfect Storm.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I don't remember them saying
Clooney.
that. Yeah.
But yeah, they show this huge 50-foot tall wave, and you just see the crest of it, and it was coming down at the boat. Anyway.
So those are a real thing now. We know that, but it's like, what causes them?
But a lot of people don't survive.
Yeah, but what causes them? That's what I want to know. probably multiple different things.
You'd have to look at fluid dynamics,
right?
And then
That's
what's
what it
happening
is.
not only
Is
just
some asshole whale
no.
like 1,000 miles before some whale does something and it just
It
slowly builds?
It is. It is fluid dynamics, Scott, and it's the trends and forces of the oceans. But Dan even uses that term fluid dynamics in this episode when he describes the effect it had on the boats, and he said, fluid
Who's
dynamics
carry the boats?
Fluid dynamics dictates that an object in the water will do what the object is doing, or do what the
Yeah,
water
that was what
is
was
doing.
really interesting too.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like the boat's going to act like the same water that it displaces.
He gives modern descriptions of rogue waves, and it's just
I know, it was great. That part was awesome.
It's crazy.
Speaking of other things you never heard of, the incredible secret of Greek fire.
Oh yeah, fucking awesome.
Okay, I'll take when we get to the point with the movies, I'd like to jump into those. But the Greek fire, 100%. Let's go, Matt.
Yeah, I'd never heard of that before either.
Okay, so Greek fire was something that I was aware of, and it was a secret weapon. For hundreds of years, and we still have not been able to recreate it nowadays. We think we might know what it is. There's
what do they think it was?
So in the episode, they talk about pitch mixed with sulfur, which didn't sound like it would do the job as well. And the way it was delivered in that form was different than what we're seeing. And that was written a couple hundred years later. So Greek fire was like napalm, distinct napalm. Okay,
right, their version of it. Right.
Yep, sticky fire. It was an absolutely secret weapon. It was okay. So what?
Think about that with wood boats.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what Dan dives into this, and I love this. He's like, this was like the nuclear launch codes being passed down from the president to his successor. Right. It was that important. There is an actual speech that like the ruler of the Byzantine Empire was supposed to give, and did give upon occasion, to their successor, their son, or their daughter.
How to make this shit.
Not how to make it. That was a closely kept secret. But if anyone asks you, if another state ruler asks you for this secret, here's what you tell to them. And it was epic. It was like, this was given to us by the gods, and one of our generals disclosed this secret, and he was struck down by fire. And it is so terrible that we cannot disclose it at the peril of our own civilization. It was literally like passing down the nuclear launch.
So remember this.
That important.
Remember this when people tell you that governments can't keep secrets.
Yeah,
we still don't know how they made this shit.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
It's used in battle the way he describes it, where they had like so there must have been some kind of a pump, because they brought out a bunch of old derelict ships and then had this spew the fire once they were surrounded. So how did that actually occur? Were there men on those ships working hand operated pumps? But they had the dispensers shaped like a lion or a dragon, and they were coated in gold, and out of their mouth
holy shit, that's awesome.
Fire. It was just imagine
if you're a Viking and then you come up to a ship,
what is going on?
And it's got a dragon on the prow, and it's shooting fucking fire
that doesn't go out when it touches the water.
Right.
Yeah. No. And you dive into the water, and it clings to your body, and you
holy shit, that had to be crazy.
Burned to death in the ocean.
Right.
Yeah,
you're used to spears, you're used to arrows, but you're not used to a flamethrower.
It had to be. Yeah. It had to be. And I'm sure there's a bunch of speculation, but if it's going to float, it's got to be like an oil-based substance, first of all.
No, it might. There's other things.
Resin, oil. It's got to be some kind of tarry substance. I mean, or you can load it in trebuchets, and then I know there's instances where they put Greek fire in trebuchets, I think.
Right. He talks about that in this episode, and then he does say the closest they come to a recipe that Dan describes is by a female ruler of the Byzantine Empire, writing some couple hundred years after the events described in the episode, but says that it was a form of tree pitch mixed with sulfur, and then the way it was deployed was that they would put it in hollow tubes like reeds, like, so you'd put it at the back of the tube, light the tip of the tube on fire, and then blow it into someone's faces, which is not how we see it being deployed in these naval battles or a lot of other ways in which Greek fire is mentioned as being deployed in ancient history.
Yeah, maybe that was just like a one-on-one weapon.
I think that was kind of like a very different, smaller version of it.
Imagine you're charging some freaking soldiers.
Totally.
And they just light fire. They light a pipe.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden your face is covered in lava.
Yeah. Or being the dude on the delivering end of that, where
what if you accidentally inhale?
Dude.
Don't cough.
Don't fuck up. Yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah, that might have killed you.
Is so crazy.
Yeah. Oh, what up?
Yeah. That's crazy.
So,
I love that. When he's talking about the Greek fire, that was fascinating.
Yeah. That was a major feature of this episode for me.
Man, so then there was basically the first king of Russia.
I don't think I got that far.
What was his, like, Matt?
Started with an
badass's name. Yeah, started with an R, wasn't it?
Then I did get that.
I can't remember it. I'm sorry.
Ah, shit. Well, anyway, that part was fun. Wasn't it Olga's son?
Yes, it was. It was.
So just type in Saint Olga's son.
It's funny. I said the first Tsar of Russia was Ivan the Terrible, but that's not.
Yeah, because that's when they started calling it czars.
He does talk about that.
And it was united. Oh, anyway, what I was gonna say is, we're talking about in this episode. You're talking about the battles around Kiev and all of that, right? And it's interesting because Russia's still fighting for that territory right now. Like literally right now. 1,200 years later.
It is very interesting hearing modern names that appear in the news every day being fought over hundreds of years ago. Absolutely.
A millennia ago.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not nothing. That's a long fucking time.
No kidding.
Europe is crazy.
It is crazy, yeah. It speaks to the strategic importance of these locations and also to the cultural significance of them.
And you think about Europe is crazy, and then you go, well, shit, the Middle East is really nuts because that shit's a couple thousand years older than that.
And everybody's been fighting over that for 10,000 years.
Yeah.
So the next note I have is the influence of women. Dan talks about this as being, and not only are there strong female leaders, but he talks about in two other aspects. One being that the conversion to Christianity of some of these Scandinavian peoples was due to the women, where like they would convert first and then get in their husband's ear about it. And there was actually a female leader who was more influential than that. Right, exactly. And also that when the men went away to war, which Viking, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the word Viking means to put down your rake, your hoe, your farming implement, and go Viking, go raiding. So when the men were going raiding, the women would be holding down the fort for months and months and months at a time.
Sometimes even a year, right?
Right. Very much like women picked up the labor burden during the Second World War in America.
Yeah, long time. And that makes me think about too. Like, so you had this tradition here in America of these long hunters that would go off into the woods for like 2 years, stacking up furs and dropping them off and selling them, and be gone for literally leave their wife and their kids for a couple of years.
Yep.
Daniel Boone did that.
Well, and you didn't even know if they were going to show up.
Yeah, shit,
or
man.
when.
Yeah, no idea.
That's loyalty.
You better not have married the other guy. You better not have moved on because he might not be dead.
Yeah.
You know? But like there was that tradition in history, and the Vikings were a part of that. It's kind of nuts. One was, Matt, it is interesting to think about too, because Dan's right. You look at the growth of Christianity, it almost always goes through the women first. And they either get a king to so they'll get married. Like that was back to France, you know, what he talked about it in Thor's Angels. Charlemagne's great ancestor or whatever. What the hell was that guy's? The most badass one, like in the 400s in France, that was first converted to Christianity.
Oh, you're
killed all his relatives and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Oh, Clovis.
Clovis. Yeah.
Clovis. Clovis is great.
I almost said Pippin, but
I mean that was the same
guy.
way with Clovis, right? He married a Christian woman, and then you know, finally she basically talked him into it.
Well, he said, if this battle goes my way, I'll,
Right.
Pretty
but that
ballsy,
might have been an
ballsy move.
Oh, maybe, or it could have been like I'm going to say this because I know we're going to win, and this will give me an excuse to shut the woman up.
I think you're talking about Constantine there. Clovis
Well,
was
no.
That
was
Clovis did it too,
okay,
I believe.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, because that's what Dan pointed out. He pointed out Clovis and Constantine in this episode. It's a traditional, like that happens all the time. Like, God, if you want me to believe in your God, he better give me victory in this battle, and if he does, then I'll convert.
Because that was very much down to the individual level of how how disputes were decided amongst these tribes. Is like two warriors would fight, and then if whoever won, well, obviously the gods were in their favor. So
Trial by arms.
That translates into divine favor if in a battle. Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. But so you think about that, the influence of women, because they were usually first, and then even if the husband didn't convert, they baptize the kid, and the husband's off raiding.
Yeah.
Especially in the Vikings, right? Husband's off raiding. Who's teaching the kid the religion?
Straight up.
Your wife.
The wife that's Christian. So that's why it takes a generation or two, and then it spreads more in the next generation. And so the Christians were playing the long game.
Yep.
Right? They're like, yep, we'll get there in the end.
Yeah. I mean, knowledge of that structure of their society would have been, an important point in a conscious adaptation by the influencers at that time. But if we're seeing Christianity as a civilizing force, which it is, which it was, then we can see women very much in the background of history being a huge influence on the civilization of those societies.
Huge. And like I talk about all the time, right? I think we've talked about on this podcast before, is like they make all the people, and then they have a large impact on raising the next generation of people, right? Especially in a culture like the Vikings, where the husbands are gone for months at a time.
Or years.
Or years, right? Who's raising the kids? Even the sons, who's raising them until they're old enough to go to war? The mom is, right?
Yep.
They're giving them that culture. Right. So if the mom is Christian, that kid's probably going to be Christian. And so they're not going to, even if they will talk about Odin to their dad, they'll be more likely to switch when the time comes or something like that too. Right.
Again, it's down to survival. Like the cultural impetus of the men was to go out and raid for resources, and the cultural impetus of the women was to preserve the next generation, literally, physically.
Yep. Absolutely. That's born into our species through evolution.
Yep. Well, there's your hunter-gatherer for you.
And there were warrior women, though, like Athelflaed, I believe her name was,
awesome.
who Dan spends a significant amount of time on, right? Like, there was no... So in that movie, popular media keeps coming up in relation to this episode, and I think it's great because there have been some good adaptations. 13th Warrior being one. I mean, even The Perfect Storm with the Rogue Waves. But as far as women warriors, I mean, there's the show Vikings, and it kind of combines a lot of the history. Rollo is in there. It does show him converting to Christianity when he, gets to Paris. It shows the Vikings raiding into Constantinople and becoming hired mercenaries as bodyguards. It shows the influence and conversion to Islam by some of the Vikings. It
That's
also
fascinating.
Yeah, it also shows warrior women, and this is kind of an important point because I remember when the show Vikings was like in its heyday, they were doing companion pieces on it, and the lady who plays Ragnar Lothbrok's first wife, the actor who plays her, was doing this behind the scenes thing, and they were doing some sort of supplemental material at a museum in that area of the world where they would dig up some Viking archaeological sites, and she was looking for evidence of female warriors, and they did find a woman buried with a sword and that kind of stuff. So there has been sort of some vague historical evidence of women warriors, but I think that nowadays, and I've actually posted some of this in the Discord, that there have been more evidence. And Dan, solidifies it. He's like, Athelflaed, check her out. She was an amazing warrior, and at this time when when warrior culture was very much based around men, he makes a point to paint the scene for you that you had men walking up to this woman, laying down their swords and swearing fealty to her.
Right, but which one was Athelflaed? Was that the one in Britain?
I don't remember.
I believe she was the one that was her brother was a king as well, or she was in England. And he talks about that, like, in reality, she probably wasn't wearing armor and going into battle, but she was the strategist, or she was the tactician.
I think
maybe
you're right about that. Yeah, there might have been.
If anything, she was the moral will and backbone of the people.
Kind of like
she gave them the spine.
We need to take a break real quick.
Yeah, that's fine. Scott's got to take a leak. You go ahead. Cool. We'll keep talking. Now you can tell me what you really think about Scott, because he doesn't have his headphones on, so you can say it. And he never listens to the episodes back, so you could say whatever you want right now, and he'll never know.
Kind of like a Joan of Arc kind of figure, where she's the inspiration and stuff like that. I see what you're saying.
Right.
I think there was two figures like that, but I do believe there were more physically oriented women in that culture. Yeah.
I think it's interesting to think about that history, and obviously those are going to be the exceptions instead of the rule, just by the nature of our species.
Yeah, sure.
But
right.
That's how everything is. That's why generalizations are stupid, right? That's why there's always going to be exceptions to those kind of things, and so you should never, women can't do this. Well, no, most women don't want to, but some women do, and some women can. And just like with dudes, it's the same thing, right? So it's like, it's good to look in history and see the examples of when people
the exception. Yeah, the exception has stood out. Yeah, and Dan does a great job of highlighting that. He loves strong women. Look at all the attention he's given to Olympias, mother of Alexander the Great.
He likes to talk about them and point out, hey, who knows how often these were there, and we just don't know the stories.
Right. His emphasis on the women being the influential force behind the conversion to Christianity, as well as holding down the civilization, or the holding down the villages and doing all the work while the men were away at war, I think really speaks to his interest in the subject, his respect for women throughout history, as well as providing a really powerful cultural milepost for us to look to when examining not only how these things occurred, but who has been left out of the history books.
Word. And Dan points it out in this episode. What he talks about is what his mom said. He's like, and it's not, you can't say that they were left out on purpose or because of sexism. It's just, what do you write down? If it bleeds, it leads. You write down the most sensational stuff.
He does,
and
say
most
that.
times the important parts of what the women do in society, tend not to be the headline making stuff. Most times.
You're sitting at home rearing the children, but he makes it important by saying, "Look, the conversion to Christianity was a huge deal. Holding down the fort while you're away at war is a huge deal. Who was doing that?
You can't go to war if nobody does that.
Yeah." I think that is a major standout of this episode for me, and I'm glad you brought that up about if it bleeds, it leads, because it is another note that I have. He approaches these stories from his background in journalism, and a thing he said, journalism is the first draft of history, and if it bleeds, it leads. We get the high points. We started this episode by talking about that, the battles, the peaks versus the procedural political stuff. There's also the procedural cultural stuff that is happening in the background that is not recorded.
That slowly change these people,
but should be emphasized exactly, and can be alluded to and understood. Sort of like jazz, where you're missing the background notes. Well, this must have happened, or else this other stuff couldn't have happened. The Vikings couldn't abandon their entire civilization, go away to war, and come back and have the crops planted, the babies reared, the animals tended to. These people were there; they were doing the work.
That's the reason they could go raiding and come home with fur coats and gold rings for their old ladies.
Straight up.
So
Rollo is a major character in here, and one thing that stood out to me was that Rollo, after he kind of gotten cooked, he had a dream of fusing the disparate societies together for war, and the entire kind of vibe of the Vikings at that point sounded like the Sea Peoples to me, who were Did you catch that too?
Yeah. You wonder, because we don't really know who the Sea Peoples were.
Well,
what if they were Vikings?
They basically were. There's been more
like
work.
Actual Vikings. What if they came around,
Scandinavian?
got on a long boat,
if you read
and made
that
it all
book,
the way down there?
If you read that book, I think 1177 BC, the Bronze Age collapse book,
Right.
that I recommended to you, I'll post it in the Discord.
Yeah.
That professor actually does a supplemental lecture on that book. It's on YouTube.
Oh,
and
cool.
he starts like calling out the names of the Sea People to his class. He's like, does that sound familiar? The Shekesh, the Mekesh, like all these people. And he's like, these were modern, this is how these names were translated, and these are probably these people. And he kind of does break down and identify a lot more of who the Sea People might have been.
They've kind of filled that blank in.
Yeah, yes, and it was very much more localized to that region.
Sure.
Than you might, and so
whereas because it would have been fun to think about them being a bunch of Scandinavians. It would have been fun to think
about it, but the dynamic is still the same. You're coming from over the sea, you're raiding, nobody knows who you are, you take what you want and you leave. And the Vikings had that advantage going for them. And Rollo's dream of bringing together all these disparate societies very much struck a chord with me as far as the Sea People.
Absolutely.
But of course, once they started settling down and accepting bribes and land and converting to Christianity, they lost that advantage. It became cooked.
Eventually. Yes. It took a while, though.
It took a while. Yeah, they were still raiding their neighbors.
Well, so here's a great thing. Here's a thought that just occurred to me. So the steppe people, they were able to be historical arsonists, conquer their neighbors that were much wealthier and all this because they had the horse. So the Vikings, their horse was the ship.
Yeah, right. Absolutely.
And so they were a smaller people from a harsher climate that was harder to survive. So they were more savage, that had a technological advantage that allowed them to harness their savagery to impact the rest of the world at a much greater amount than they normally would have been able to. And it's the same thing as the steppe people.
It's true. And the river system that they used as highways to, hey, commerce is built around the rivers, so they just cruised their ships up those rivers, hit them, and then retreated.
And how the hell do you find your way home?
Stars.
That's
the navigational charts, or navigational knowledge was absolutely impressive. I think sometimes Dan makes a point of saying this. It's that very specifically, at least some places were found accidentally.
Oh yeah.
Like when
just about everywhere.
How boats were blown by the Arctic winds, and you're kind of there's only sails, so wherever it takes you is where you're going.
Another thing Dan talks about in this episode that was great is these are the first people that we know of that really started to get away from the coast.
Yeah,
that's such a huge thing.
Thank you. That's something I hadn't written down, but had struck. I'm glad you brought that up.
Right.
So why for so long were these continents disconnected? Right. It's because it was so much safer to just do commerce along the coast. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Even he even says even the Phoenicians, the greatest seafaring people of the ancient world, they basically plied the coast. They just, did their thing.
Well, the Mediterranean's tiny compared to like a real ocean, right? So you could go all the way around the coast and make it somewhere to Africa without doing that much.
And that goes all the way to Columbus, where he had to convince these people, send an expedition across the ocean.
Right.
It's like, why would I risk building a ship, funding a ship, insuring a ship, the cargo, the crew? That's expensive, and especially if fleet of them or even 3 like Columbus was provided with. Like, you look at it from a cost benefit analysis, like, why would I risk all this on this insane venture? And Columbus was wrong about all his navigation from the get-go, and the people who were funding him knew that. I'm doing just fine around the coast here. You know what I mean? But the Vikings didn't have that because they'd already raided their neighbors a ton of times.
Yeah, so they finally had to start going
looking further, right?
for more loot.
Yeah, but Dan does throw a caveat in there about the Polynesians, about how they've now that the waters were warmer, it's more moderate temperature.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, but the Polynesians made it all the way to Chile.
But what they talk about with the Polynesians, though, the interesting thing is when they were spreading out from island to island, a lot of that is thought to have occurred before the end of the last ice age.
Sure.
The sea levels were way lower, and so those islands were way less far apart than we think of now. Right.
Very good point.
There is some people that will tell you that they think that they maybe were not actually getting that far out of sight of the other islands.
Gotcha.
I mean, like a lot of that island hopping was happening because you could see the one off in the distance or go out a little bit and see it.
Gotcha.
Because think about how much more land there is if you drop sea levels 200 feet.
Wow.
And
you put a mile of ice.
In the Pacific,
yes,
not much.
A lot. That's what I'm talking about. Put a mile of ice above us right now in Michigan, a mile of ice.
Yeah.
All that fresh water, all that water is locked up on top of the surface. You're gaining a whole land bridge in the Pacific, dude.
Yeah.
That was, 500 miles wide? All those islands.
The Pacific?
No, I'm saying the land bridge, the Beringia or whatever it was over like a 500 miles wide. It's not like some little bridge. It was a continent, right, almost.
Yeah.
That's the same thing that was happening in the South Pacific, too. Those islands were way closer.
Yeah.
So it's not like they were getting in these canoes and just going far. As far as we don't, some people are at least arguing that it really wasn't near as impressive as it looks on paper right now.
Well, I think environmental science.
Like, how the hell did they get in that little boat with an outrigger and make it there, right? And it seems insane. But maybe they went boom, 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 boom instead of boom.
Yeah.
Right?
Well,
there's a connect the dots.
But there'd have to be food on that island, too.
Yeah, there was trees. There was all that shit. As
How
far
did
as
the
we
tree
know,
get there?
The same way trees get everywhere. Birds eat the seeds and then stop at that island when they're traveling and they shit. But that's how they got there now. That's how they got there now.
Sure. Or people left them there. Or people left them there.
Yeah, but probably not the first ones. I mean, they look at Hawaii, right? They showed up there. The first people showed up there, and it was I'm sure there was already birds and trees and grasses and all that shit, right?
Sure, but then pig were introduced and just let to run wild.
Yeah. So, okay.
Anyway,
this is a digression, but I want to say this one real quick. So, Meat Eater podcast, I like to listen to Meat Eater podcast, and they talk about conservation and a lot of stuff. One of the things he mentions all the time is he knows these people that are from Hawaii, and they like to talk about how they mention how people call pigs invasive. When literally the first Hawaiians that showed up there are the ones that brought the pigs.
Sure.
So if the pigs are invasive, so are the fucking Hawaiians. So stop calling the pigs invasive. They've been there thousands of years.
So was sugar.
They've been there
wasn't there
thousands of years. Like, how long do they have to be there before we stop calling them invasive?
For sure.
Anyway, that's a digression. I think we should probably get close to wrapping this episode up.
Yeah. We didn't even talk about the burial.
Oh yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Let's finish on Viking funerals.
Let's do Scott's passion right now, and then I do have something to kind of close this with in my.
The 13th Warrior? Yeah.
And then I do have something to kind of close this with in my notes. So I think
Sure.
Let's
okay, so we're gonna talk about the Viking funerals.
The 13th Warrior.
And no, you already talked about that. I forgot. We already talked about that.
Yeah, but no, what? The
you already talked about the 13th Warrior.
No.
Oh, you're gonna talk. Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
So, anyway, the most of the story that you watch on the 13th Warrior, you watch the movie. What Dan got into had nothing to do. Well, had the first half hour, 15 minutes of the movie was the account from the Arabian diplomat, right? Mm-hmm. And then the first 15 minutes of the movie, the old king dies, and they say, "Oh, this is the old ways of the burial," and like this maiden's being lifted up, and she's like chanting something. Now they don't show her being going back to the burial part.
So in the episode of Hardcore History, Dan gets into the description of what a prominent Vikings funeral would be like.
Sure.
We all know about the Viking funeral pyres and all that, which sounds badass.
But not included is the interpersonal stuff that happened with his clan.
The crazy amount.
I'm not sure how graphic you're going to be about that right now,
Okay.
Scott.
Oh, come on.
In the story, he talks about they ask for volunteers and of maidens to die with to burn with the victim or with the dead person. And so when one says yes, then they can't back out. And then they proceed to get drunk, gang raped, and then murdered. Ritually sacrificed.
Yep.
And then burned with the deceased person.
Yep.
So let's first of all, kind of, it is sexual assault, but it's kind of, and it sounds horrible, but there is a compliance there. There is a willingness. They are saying, I'm doing this because I love you. But think about that poor woman. She knew what she was getting into. But this culture that says all of my men must have sex with my favored slave prior to her being sacrificed to accompany me in the afterlife is freaking horrific. And
crazy.
Like, the culture that built any sort of compliance into this woman's mind. And Dan makes a very specific point that right before she died, she was backing out. She didn't want to go into the tent, but then
she might have been, but she
couldn't
back out.
And then all that happened, and then the old woman who is the angel of death comes in, and then they put a noose around her neck, 2 men tighten it, and then the angel of death woman just starts stabbing her in the ribs. I mean, that is so hardcore.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
So
that was not shown in the movie.
Circling back to the movie, the guy actually looks at Abin is what they ended up calling him in the movie.
Ibn, which means son of.
Ibn.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's the word most repeated in his many names.
Yep. So anyway, so he goes, "This is the old ways. You won't see this again." Like,
wow.
To the diplomat. So anyway, but then the very beginning, it's funny because he's going to search for peoples and to be an ambassador, and they even say the Tartars are coming. So they all start running the other way, and then they run into the Vikings. It was anyway. I don't know,
which is freaking crazy to think about.
Yeah.
And the rest of the story, Dan didn't expand on that for his 2 years of hanging out with the Vikings. So I'm not sure, if the rest of that story, Matt, do you know if the rest of that story is accurate, or is that all?
No, honestly, I've always wanted to read Eaters of the Dead, and listening to this episode made me want to delve more into whatever that's based on. So that's going to be my next move. Like, seriously, I'll report back.
Well, when you do that, then we'll talk about it again. That sounds interesting.
Right on.
Okay, Matt, what was your finishing move?
So the conglomerate, the redrawing of borders. Dan talks about in the post script to this episode. He talks about Newfoundland, Canada, like all these places, and we're seeing that this directly related to me to Celtic Holocaust. Okay, because he talks about how these cultures have survived. Like, okay, sure, these people are gone. The Vikings don't exist anymore. Do they? The language is there. The borders are there. The names are there. The culture is there.
No, the culture's not there.
Scott's relative, still remembers Saint Olga. People still believe in elves.
Fairies.
And he talks about it. He talks about that at the end of Celtic Holocaust, where his old babysitter, Dan was so into Roman history that he said, but the Romans won, and his babysitter of Celtic descent said, "Do they? What language are they speaking over there right now?" You know what I mean?
So, we're still speaking Irish, right? But
right.
That's what's interesting, though, right? Is because those people, they're not the same people, though.
No,
they're not, because none of us are.
They don't need to be anymore. International commerce is provided for the resources.
Not anymore. That's what ancient DNA's really showed us, is it's always been like that. And Dan talks about in this episode, the exchange of DNA has always been there, and it's just not talked about, right? Slaves, traders, all kinds of things. But really, people were always moving.
Yeah.
And so Ancient DNA shows us that very rarely are the people that were there 2,000 years ago very closely related to the people that are in an area now. There's a few exceptions, but for the most part, they're not very closely related, any more so than anyone else, because people are constantly moving.
Yep.
Right? That's humans, and there's always been an interplay of humans and an exchange of DNA, an exchange of cultures. And so, are the people in Scandinavia Viking? No. Because, like Dan said, what makes somebody a Viking? That's how he ends the episode, right? What makes somebody a Viking? To him, it's the religion.
Yeah.
And there's not a lot of people practicing that religion anymore.
There are.
Not a lot, though.
Yeah, maybe not. And he says that in Celtic Holocaust too. He's like, well, Celtic. I'm going to make a T-shirt. Being Celtic is a state of mind, and so the definition of what identifies as that is, somewhat fluid. But I would say that, getting back to the beginning of our conversation, that's kind of what made them Viking in the first place, is their religion, right?
That's what I'm saying. Yeah, that's what I was trying to say. If Dan's right about that, then then the people in Sweden and Scandinavia, they're not Vikings. If you look at real quick, I'll finish and then you can finish us. But you look at what these Vikings were like, and then you look at what Scandinavians are like. You're like, those are not Vikings. Thank God they're not.
I don't know.
We should be happy they're not.
No, you go to Iceland and you get like Hafthor.
That is not the same thing. Are they? They're not. They're cooked.
Sure.
They're cooked.
He's cooked.
That's what you want. Those are not Vikings. Vikings are not cooked. By definition, a Viking is an uncooked savage.
Sure.
So if you have cooked people, they're not Vikings anymore, which is great because we don't want a world, just like we don't want pirates. People like to talk about buccaneers and pirates and celebrate that shit like it's fun, right? Pirates suck, right? You don't want a world where there's a lot of pirates, just like you don't want a world where there's Vikings. That's not good for any of us.
So let's not call them Vikings then. Let's call them, something under the term of Scandinavians. And the culture, what Dan's episodes on this subject have shown us is that there was much more to these people than the barbarism, that it was a matter of it. Yeah. And that culture is very much still alive.
You're right. That's a good point. There is still the civilized aspects of that culture did not leave. And they slowly cooked away the savagery, just like all of us. Literally, all of our cultures.
Yeah, that's it.
All the cultures.
Well,
we've
talked about.
Yeah,
go ahead.
No, we are cooked versions of our former selves, and we need to realize that. That's something, Dan Carlin's work. Yeah, it is good.
But Matt, I have a point that I'd like to bring up.
Please do.
How much would it take for us to
revert,
become uncooked?
Okay, so here's the point. Okay, why did those things disappear from their culture? Because they were no longer necessary.
Correct.
Right. Remove the provisos, the things that are providing us those resources that make slavery and raiding no longer necessary. It's just down to survival, and everyone will absolutely engage in activities that ensure the safety of their children, the food on your plate at the end of the day. Civilization is a thin veneer.
Yes, but
religion holds it together to a certain point. But religion can be used to radicalize people towards warfare.
It can be. But what I would say is, what happens when somebody that is a civilized culture has to fight savages? Historically, right? That thin veneer of civilization, it makes soft men.
Sure.
Right? It makes soft men. So, yes, eventually we revert being hard men, but that is not the first generation that does that. That's the second generation.
No.
Yeah, man.
I disagree.
Historically, it is.
I disagree.
Okay, but historically, it is.
I would think.
Why were Asia so easy to conquer for the Greeks and then for the Romans? Because those Romans and Greeks were much closer to being savages than the Asians were. They had been broke to the yoke of empire for 1,000 years under the Assyrians, and so the next guy coming in was like, these guys are bitches, and they just wiped them out. And that's why, because they were.
I don't think
Sorry.
Persia was incredibly easy to conquer for the Greeks. If you're talking Macedonian,
I'm talking about once you get
okay,
where you get Alexander.
Up until that point, well,
I'm saying, like,
Alexander did not easily conquer Persia. He was a brilliant strategist and tactician,
but he was
and
way outnumbered and still conquered them.
That's tactics. On the battlefield, he defeated their king and then went around and then through guerrilla warfare and the adaptation of his army to that form of warfare for that environment, swept up all possible successors to the throne of the King of Kings. As far as the Romans go, when you talk about Asia, you're talking about Parthia. Crassus got his butt kicked. Not a great general, still had the legions behind him. Bad strategy.
Parthia wasn't the Asia I'm talking about. That was the steppe people.
Mark Antony got his butt kicked. Okay, so how far did the Romans and the Greeks make it into?
Well, but they took over large swaths of Asia. The parts that were already conquered. Right, that's what they conquered because they were broke to the yoke of empire. Right,
that's a good point. All right,
right. So there's no denying that the farther we're removed from uncivilization, the easier it is to conquer us by somebody who's uncivilized.
Which would sort of speak to an innate longing for peace, safety,
maybe. Hard times make hard men, and soft times or easy times make soft men, and that's what happens.
You spoke about that in your previous episode, George and Scott, and I think it was really cool. It was old school toughness episode, and it was the title of your episode. And I see you've been listening to Sean Ryan. He talks about that too.
Yeah.
So when we talk about America, I'm going to be perfectly honest here. I think you folks had a lot of generalizations going on with America as being soft, and I think that because I live in a region. I'm taking this, not the country, not the state, but the region of the state.
You're right. That's a great point. We should have done that.
If you go down to Seattle right now, okay, look what happened with the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. And I know people who live in Capitol Hill, okay? I used to live there myself. And they had the ultimate hippie stuff, good defund the police, and they had some like vegetable garden going on the side of the road, okay? It was ridiculous, okay? But then you go up to where I live, like everybody has guns and they hunt and we can take care of ourselves over the winter. Like, you know what I mean? It's a different, and that is a macrocosm of America. America isn't soft. Right. We have classes of people who are soft due to the conditions which you've spoken of, George. But also, Andy Stumpf talks about we have an elite class of people who are volunteering to be in our military, and they're very hard people, and they're holding the fort.
100% right there. That's a great point, Matt. Thank you for pointing that out. America's too huge to break it down like that.
Well, the other thing, since you bring up the military, I have a number of friends that are veterans. And the interesting part is, or what I've heard many of them say, is they all talk about Valhalla. I swear to God, when it comes to like Viking, religious beliefs, I have heard it more often than not.
Right. I've heard that too.
It's like the warrior code is what they're living. It kind of
is, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense, right? If you're that kind of a warrior lifestyle, that religion, those ideas are much more suited to that culture.
Sure. Correct.
And why wouldn't you? It makes sense. And that's going to speak to a very ancient part of people, of humans, especially certain humans, right?
Well, not just
because there's a lot of variation in individuals in our species.
And then it's the camaraderie in battle. So everybody's going through, like you guys said earlier, everybody's going through the same trauma. So you have all the same brotherhood. And then, some of your friends die, and that's,
right.
I'll see you in the halls of Valhalla. I've heard veterans say that before.
Right.
So anyway, I just wanted to kind of tie that into like modern militaristic behavior or culture.
And Matt, we'll have to have you back on to talk about that, because I think that's an interesting point that I had not thought of. And I can see some pushback, but this isn't the right episode for that. Let's come on and talk about that sometime, because that'll be a fun conversation.
Anytime, man.
Cool. All right, everybody, thanks for watching. again, check the link in the description. We're going to do a live event to discuss the new episode. Once we're going to give the rest of you normal people time to listen to the whole episode. We're assuming you didn't plow through it like we did. So take your time. Yeah, that's why we're talking hardcore, guys. So we'll give you some more time, and we'll do that event in a couple of weeks. And look for that. And again, thanks, Matt, for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Me.
You
appreciate it, guys.
Really make it a lot easier to do this podcast.
Oh, for sure.
We would have to do way more work.
No.
We wouldn't do the work, but the podcast wouldn't be as good.
Yeah, I mean, Matt, you are a absolute wonderful contributor.
Wealth of knowledge.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Wealth of knowledge.
Yeah, we really appreciate it, buddy. All right.
Yeah,
Don't